For many of us, especially those with social anxiety, isolation can paradoxically become a safe haven. This video dives deep into the mind, revealing why we sometimes choose the familiar quiet over the unpredictable world, even when it holds us back. The first thing isolation gives you is relief, a quiet, immediate easing of pressure that feels almost medicinal. When you pull back from people, the noise of judgment, expectation, or misunderstanding suddenly fades. No one is watching you, no one is evaluating your words, and no one is silently measuring your worth. For a moment, the world becomes simpler. You can breathe without worrying about how you appear or whether you said the wrong thing. That instant comfort is powerful, and it teaches your mind something dangerous. Solitude feels safer than people. It feels predictable, gentle, and free of the invisible demands that make social moments feel heavy. Even when nothing catastrophic happens around others, the possibility of being judged or misunderstood creates a kind of background tension. Isolation removes that tension, turning silence into a shield you begin to trust more than the presence of others. The brain is wired for survival, not social perfection. It reacts to emotional discomfort the same way it reacts to danger. If a situation makes you feel exposed, awkward, or uncertain, your brain marks it as a potential threat. It doesn't care whether the threat is a physical attack or an uncomfortable conversation. It just wants you away from what feels unsafe. Over time, even ordinary interactions can feel like too much. Someone asking a personal question, someone misreading your tone, someone expecting you to perform socially. These small things register as subtle stress signals. The brain, trying to protect you, begins prioritizing avoidance. It starts whispering that staying alone is easier, less risky, and more predictable. And because avoidance instantly removes discomfort, the brain quickly learns to prefer it. The less you engage, the more your mind reinforces the belief that people are unpredictable and solitude is the only place where nothing can go wrong. But this avoidance has a cost, and the cycle it creates becomes hard to break. When you withdraw, your anxiety doesn't actually disappear. It only hides until the next time you have to interact. The longer you stay away from people, the more foreign social situations begin to feel. You lose the small daily exposures that keep confidence alive. What once felt slightly uncomfortable now feels overwhelming. What once required a bit of effort now feels like a threat to your sense of control. This is how isolation grows roots. Avoidance reduces anxiety in the moment, but it expands anxiety everywhere else. The brain adapts too well to the quiet, and soon even simple interactions feel intimidating because you're no longer used to them. Eventually, isolation becomes a loop. You avoid because it feels safe, and because you avoid, the outside world starts feeling even less safe. The temporary relief turns into dependence. Interactions that were once normal now feel like something you have to mentally prepare for. You begin rehearsing conversations, planning exits, analyzing every word you might say. The silence that once comforted you begins shaping your identity. You start believing you function better alone, not because solitude is your true nature, but because your brain has been trained to fear anything uncertain. The same mechanism that once protected you slowly becomes the reason connection feels unreachable. And without realizing it, the safety you found in isolation becomes the very thing that keeps you from stepping outside it. There is a certain comfort in the familiar, even when the familiar is small, quiet, and painfully limiting. When you choose isolation, you choose a world you already understand, a world with no surprises, no shifting dynamics, and no emotional risks. You know exactly what the day will feel like. You know the rhythm of your own silence, the habits that keep everything predictable, and the absence of unexpected demands. In contrast, being around people introduces variables you can't prepare for. A sudden change in tone, an unexpected question, a misunderstanding, a moment where you have to respond faster than your anxiety allows. The uncertainty of social interaction, even neutral interaction, can feel like stepping into a landscape filled with invisible traps. So you choose the environment where nothing unpredictable can happen. The safety is not in solitude itself, but in the consistency it offers, a world that stays the same because you keep it that way. Over time, predictability becomes a strategy. You begin shaping your routines in ways that minimize exposure to anything that might trigger anxiety. You wake up at the same time, you move through your day the same way, and you avoid anything that threatens to disrupt the calm. You eat alone to avoid judgment. You work in silence to avoid pressure. You keep your circle small or empty because the fewer people involved in your life, the fewer chances there are for things to go wrong. Slowly, your routines become a shield. They narrow your life, but they stabilize your emotions. And because these routines lower anxiety in the moment, your brain learns to depend on them. The habits that were originally meant to help you cope begin to dictate your movements. You find yourself repeating the same behaviors, not because they bring joy, but because they keep fear away. The irony is that these self-imposed structures can feel like self-care. You tell yourself you're protecting your peace. You tell yourself solitude helps you recharge, even when it starts lasting days or weeks. You call your isolation boundaries, even when it's avoidance. You tell yourself you prefer being alone, because convincing yourself of that is easier than confronting the deeper truth. That connection feels risky, unpredictable, and exhausting. The line between caring for yourself and hiding from the world becomes blurry. You don't notice when the quiet routine you created for comfort begins to harden into a lifestyle. You don't see how the behaviors you adopted to soothe anxiety start reinforcing the very fears you tried to escape. This is the subtle trap of predictability. It feels healthy. It feels responsible. It feels like you're choosing yourself. And in small doses, predictability can be grounding. But when it becomes the only way you feel safe, it begins shaping how you see others and how you see yourself. Social interactions start to seem unnecessary, then overwhelming, then impossible. You convince yourself that the simplicity of your life is proof of emotional maturity, when it's often proof of emotional withdrawal. Routine slowly becomes a cage disguised as comfort. It limits your world while convincing you that you're better off not leaving it. Isolation doesn't always announce itself as a problem. Sometimes it's quiet, gentle, and deceptively nurturing. It tells you that you're doing the right thing by staying where nothing can hurt you, where everything stays predictable, where peace comes from control instead of connection. And by the time you realize how much you've given up to maintain that control, predictability has already become the price you pay for the illusion of emotional safety. Social anxiety isn't just a feeling, it's a neurological pattern that reshapes how the brain interprets connection, reward, and risk. When someone lives with persistent anxiety around people, the brain begins to associate social situations with heightened threat. The amygdala, the region responsible for detecting danger, becomes overactive, firing alarms even in harmless interactions. A simple conversation, a slight change in someone's expression, or an unexpected social cue can trigger the same stress response meant for real physical threats. At the same time, the brain's reward system becomes less responsive to positive social experiences. Warm interactions, shared laughter, moments of genuine connection, these experiences release dopamine and oxytocin in most people, reinforcing the desire for social bonding. But in a socially anxious brain, the fear circuitry often overrides the reward circuitry. Safety becomes prioritized over pleasure, caution over curiosity, and avoidance over engagement. This neurological imbalance creates a loop where the absence of positive social reinforcement makes connection feel less rewarding, while the anticipation of discomfort makes isolation feel far safer. Rewiring this system doesn't require dramatic leaps. It begins with small, intentional steps that gently interrupt old patterns. The brain changes through repetition, not sudden transformation. Introducing a small positive social moment, even something as simple as saying a brief hello, holding eye contact for a second longer, or engaging in a short conversation with someone familiar, can begin retraining the brain to notice safety instead of threat. Each small interaction becomes a corrective experience, teaching the nervous system that not every social moment ends in discomfort. Over time, these tiny exposures accumulate, creating new associations of ease, familiarity, and predictability. The key is to make these steps manageable. When challenges are too big, the brain returns to its fear-based patterns. When they are small and deliberate, the brain adapts without triggering overwhelm. Challenging negative thought patterns also plays a crucial role. Social anxiety often comes with a running internal commentary that predicts embarrassment, rejection, or failure before anything has actually happened. The brain becomes conditioned to expect the worst because that expectation once felt protective. Gently questioning these thoughts, not fighting them, but noticing them helps create a moment of pause before the habitual fear response takes over. Asking simple questions like, is this thought a fact or a fear? Or has this scenario actually happened, or is my mind preparing for danger? Can disrupt the automatic anxiety cycle. With repetition, the brain begins to learn that not all internal warnings are accurate. It becomes more flexible, less reactive, and more open to the possibility that connection might not be as threatening as it once believed. Exposure therapy builds on this idea, but in a kinder, more controlled way. It's not about forcing yourself into overwhelming situations. It's about gradually introducing the brain to what it fears while ensuring a sense of safety. Exposure works because it teaches the nervous system that feared situations can be experienced without consequences. The more controlled and predictable the exposure, the more effectively the brain updates its patterns. It might start with short interactions, sitting in a public space without engaging, or practicing simple conversations with someone trusted. Over time, the brain's alarm signals weaken as it becomes accustomed to these experiences. What once triggered stress begins to feel familiar, and familiarity creates a sense of calm. Rewiring the brain for connection isn't about becoming a different person. It's about helping the brain understand that safety and connection can coexist, that not every interaction requires protection, and that the reward of being understood or accepted can slowly outweigh the fear of being judged. By moving gently, repeating small exposures, and challenging the stories fear has written, the brain slowly learns to trust connection again. The process is gradual, but each step forward helps rebuild the pathways that allow you to find comfort not only in solitude, but eventually in the presence of others. Social anxiety reshapes the brain in ways that make connection feel risky, even when the danger isn't real. At the center of this experience is the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, which becomes overly sensitive to social cues. A harmless comment, a neutral expression, or even the anticipation of speaking to someone can trigger the same physiological responses designed for true threats. The heart races, the chest tightens, and the mind loops through worst-case scenarios because the brain has learned to associate people with unpredictability. At the same time, the brain's reward system, which relies on neurotransmitters like dopamine and oxytocin, becomes less responsive to the positive aspects of connection. Moments that should feel warm or reassuring barely register because the fear circuitry is louder than the reward circuitry. The imbalance creates a cycle. Fear blocks the reward, and the absence of reward reinforces the fear. Over time, the brain mistakenly learns that isolation is safer, calmer, and more predictable than engaging with others, even when part of you longs for connection. Rewiring this system doesn't happen through force or sudden leaps into overwhelming social situations. The brain changes through small, repeated experiences that introduce safety where fear once lived. This begins with deliberate, manageable steps that gently challenge the old patterns. A simple greeting to a neighbor, a brief moment of eye contact at a store, or a short voice note to someone you trust can serve as tiny corrective experiences. Each small moment shows the brain that social interaction doesn't always lead to discomfort or judgment. The goal is not to perform or be perfect, but to allow the nervous system to collect evidence that human connection can be calm, predictable, and even pleasant. Repetition matters more than intensity. When you consistently offer the brain low-pressure interactions, it begins adjusting its expectations. The amygdala's alarm weakens, and the reward system slowly wakes back up, noticing small positive cues it previously ignored. Challenging the internal narrative is another piece of this rewiring. Social anxiety often operates through automatic negative thought patterns, the belief that you will be judged, misunderstood, or embarrassed long before anything actually happens. These thoughts feel like warnings, but most of them are simply remnants of past experiences the brain is trying to avoid repeating. Instead of fighting these thoughts, gently observing them creates space. Noticing when the mind jumps to conclusions, asking whether the fear is based on evidence or habit, or reframing a neutral interaction can interrupt the old pathways. When you question the thought instead of accepting it as truth, the brain becomes more flexible. You teach it to consider possibilities other than fear, and over time, these small moments of awareness reshape its expectations. The process is slow, but each interruption weakens the automatic pull of anxiety. Exposure therapy builds on these concepts but emphasizes control and gentleness. It's not about throwing yourself into the deep end of social discomfort. It's about designing tiny, predictable exposures that help the brain relearn safety. These exposures should be short, specific, and achievable, choosing a quiet cafe instead of a busy restaurant, speaking to one familiar person instead of a crowd, or spending a few minutes in a social space without needing to interact. The key is predictability. When the brain knows what to expect, it can experience the situation without sending out alarms. Each successful exposure sends a new message to the nervous system. This is safe. I can survive this. Nothing bad happened. The more often these moments occur, the more the brain updates its wiring. Rewiring the brain for connection is neither fast nor dramatic. It is a gentle accumulation of new experiences that slowly outnumber the old ones. It's the steady practice of giving the brain opportunities to learn that people are not the threat it once believed. Through small steps, thoughtful challenges, and controlled exposures, the mind begins to balance itself, allowing connection to feel less like a danger and more like something you can approach at your own pace. Breaking the cycle of isolation begins with understanding what drives it beneath the surface. Most people don't withdraw simply because they prefer being alone. They withdraw because certain moments, memories, or fears make connection feel unsafe. These triggers vary from person to person. For some, it's the fear of being judged the moment they speak. For others, it's the fear of disappointing someone, being misunderstood, or feeling exposed without any control. Sometimes the trigger is rooted in past rejection, childhood emotional neglect, humiliation, or a single painful experience that taught the brain to associate people with unpredictability. Identifying these triggers requires paying attention to the moments when the urge to isolate spikes. Is it when conversations become emotional, when you're asked a personal question, when someone looks at you longer than expected, or when you're around people who talk over you or misunderstand you easily? Mapping these reactions helps you understand the deeper fears beneath them. Fears of inadequacy, fears of being seen, fears of losing control, or fears of not being enough. Once you see the pattern, the isolation feels less like a mystery and more like a protective strategy your mind has been overusing. Breaking the cycle doesn't mean suddenly becoming outgoing or forcing yourself into draining situations. It starts with building a sense of support through low-pressure interactions that don't drain your emotional energy. A supportive social circle doesn't have to be large. It simply has to be safe. This might begin with one person, someone who doesn't demand emotional labor, someone who listens without judgment, someone who doesn't overwhelm you. Even brief, calm interactions with this kind of person can help reset the nervous system's expectations. From there, expanding your circle slowly can feel less intimidating. Engaging in environments built around shared interests, book clubs, hobby groups, online communities, or small gatherings creates situations where the interaction is guided by activity rather than performance. These low-pressure spaces help ease the fear of being scrutinized because the focus isn't solely on you. Over time, consistent exposure to non-threatening interactions teaches the brain that connection doesn't always bring discomfort, and that there are people who can meet you with gentleness rather than judgment. Another part of breaking the cycle is addressing the guilt and shame that often accompany social anxiety. Many people blame themselves for their difficulty connecting, as if their fear is a personal failure rather than a psychological response. They feel guilty for avoiding invitations, ashamed for struggling with basic conversations, or embarrassed about needing solitude to regulate themselves. But guilt only deepens the cycle because it reinforces the belief that something is wrong with you. Shame narrows your world until you begin hiding even from the possibility of connection. What helps is reframing the experience. Social anxiety is not a character flaw. It's a learned response, shaped by past experiences and reinforced by the brain's attempt to protect you. Seeking support, whether through a friend, a mentor, or a mental health professional, is not weakness but an act of courage. External help offers perspective the anxious mind cannot always give itself. A therapist, for example, can help you unpack patterns that feel too tangled to understand alone. They can teach coping skills that regulate the nervous system, offer guidance through exposure exercises, and provide a stable space to practice vulnerability. Breaking the cycle requires compassion toward yourself at every step. It means accepting that recovery is not linear and that some days will feel harder than others. It means recognizing that isolation served a purpose once, even if it limits you now. Each time you acknowledge your fears without judgment, each time you take a small social step, and each time you allow someone to support you, you loosen the grip solitude has on your life. Slowly, with patience, the walls built for protection begin to soften. You start experiencing moments of connection that feel genuine, manageable, and safe. And over time, the cycle of isolation no longer defines you, not because the solitude disappears, but because you finally learned how to step beyond it without fear. Stepping out of isolation is rarely a dramatic moment. It's usually a series of small, almost invisible choices that slowly pull you toward a wider, fuller life. And while isolation can feel safe in the moment, growth happens in the space just beyond that safety. The long-term benefits of leaving the comfort of solitude become clear only when you begin to experience what connection actually offers. The warmth of being understood, the relief of sharing your thoughts without hiding, and the unexpected joy that comes from letting someone into your world. Genuine connection doesn't erase your fears, but it gives you a new kind of strength. The kind that is rooted in being seen rather than being hidden. Opportunities arise when you step into spaces where other people exist. Opportunities for friendship, collaboration, learning, and self-discovery. When you meet new people or experience new environments, parts of yourself wake up that isolation kept quiet. You start learning things about who you are in relation to others, how you communicate, what you value, and what you're capable of. Little by little, you find pieces of yourself you didn't know you were missing, simply because isolation never asked you to look for them. Navigating social situations with confidence doesn't mean eliminating discomfort. It means learning to move forward even when that discomfort is present. Practical steps help make this transition feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Start with environments that feel predictable, a small gathering, a familiar cafe, or a place where you don't feel pressured to perform. Prepare simple conversational anchors, a question you can ask someone, a comment about your surroundings, or a topic you feel comfortable discussing. These small tools reduce the mental load of interaction. Pay attention to your breathing, your posture, and the pace of your speech. Grounding your body helps calm your thoughts. Give yourself permission to step away briefly if you feel overstimulated. The goal is not to appear confident, but to build trust with yourself. Trust that you can handle moments of awkwardness, moments of silence, and moments of uncertainty. Confidence grows from repetition, from showing up again and again, even imperfectly. Instead of focusing on impressing others, focus on staying present. Each interaction becomes easier not because you become someone new, but because you start believing that who you are is enough. The deeper shift happens when you realize that true comfort isn't found by avoiding what scares you, but by facing it gently and consistently. Avoidance keeps the fear alive, feeding it with every moment of retreat. But when you choose to move toward the things that unsettle you, a conversation, a social event, a moment of vulnerability, the fear slowly begins to lose its power. You discover that discomfort is not a sign to turn back, but a natural part of growth. Every time you take a step outside your comfort zone, you prove to yourself that fear doesn't define your limits. You begin to recognize your own resilience, your ability to adapt, and your capacity to build a life that isn't shaped solely by protection. This realization is empowering because it replaces helplessness with agency. You're no longer controlled by anxiety. You're actively participating in your own expansion. As you continue stepping beyond isolation, the world around you starts to feel less intimidating. The relationships you build become sources of support rather than stress. The opportunities you encounter spark curiosity instead of fear, and the person you become feels more connected, more aware, and more capable. Growth doesn't ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be willing. Each step outside your comfort zone becomes evidence that you can face the uncertainty of connection without losing yourself. Over time, you learn that the real comfort was never in hiding, but in trusting that you can move through the world with openness, courage, and a sense of belonging.